A millionaire pays a homeless woman to have his child, but when the baby was born, what he discovered left him absolutely shocked. Before the start of the story, comment below where are you watching from? Enjoy the story. Daniel, a man who seemingly had it all, wealth, power, and a life meticulously curated to reflect success. But beneath the polished surface, there was a void, one he believed could be filled by a single act, leaving behind a legacy in the form of a child. On the other side of the city, Emily was struggling to survive another day. Homeless, hungry, and worn down by life's relentless blows, her focus was on survival, not dreams. Their paths crossed under the most unlikely of circumstances. The man, driven by a desire for control and perfection, proposed an unconventional agreement. The woman, desperate and with little to lose, saw an opportunity to escape her circumstances, even if just temporarily. The terms were simple. She would bear his child and he would provide her with financial security beyond what she had ever known. It was a business deal, devoid of emotion, or so they thought. For the man, it wasn't just about a child. It was about creating someone who could carry his legacy, embodying everything he valued: strength, intelligence, and discipline. For the woman, it was a way out of a desperate situation, an escape from the cold streets and the uncertainty of tomorrow. As the agreement was drawn up, the contrast between their lives became glaringly apparent. His world of luxury, control, and ambition clashed with her world of survival, adaptability, and raw emotion. Yet, for a brief moment, they found common ground, a shared sense of hope, albeit for entirely different reasons. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. The millionaire's obsession with perfection hinted at future conflicts, while the woman's deep-seated fears and mistrust hinted at emotional storms to come. The story was just beginning, but one thing was clear: the journey ahead would be anything but simple. Stay with this story to see how an arrangement meant to solve problems led to revelations neither could prepare for. Daniel wasn't born into wealth. In fact, his early years were anything but easy. Growing up in a small, struggling town, he often watched his parents work themselves to exhaustion just to make ends meet. His father was a factory worker who rarely spoke, and his mother worked odd jobs, always worried about how they'd pay the next bill. Daniel learned at a young age that the world didn't hand you anything, you had to take it. That realization became his driving force, shaping the man he would eventually become. Even as a teenager, Daniel stood out. While others spent their afternoons at football practice or hanging out, he was hustling, mowing lawns, fixing old electronics, and doing whatever he could to earn money. But it wasn't just about making cash. Daniel had an unshakable belief that he could create a better life for himself. It was this belief that propelled him to excel in school. Teachers noticed his determination and intellect, but Daniel's ambition often made him seem cold to those around him. He wasn't interested in friendships or relationships. For him, every interaction was transactional, useful only if it helped him move closer to his goals. After graduating at the top of his class, Daniel earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. It was a chance to escape the limitations of his hometown, and he seized it with both hands. But even at college, he was different. While his peers partied and explored their newfound freedom, Daniel was single-minded in his focus. He spent long nights in the library, poring over business books, studying market trends, and crafting plans for his future. He didn't have time for distractions, not even romantic ones. Relationships, he thought, were a liability, a drain on his time and energy. By the time Daniel graduated, he had already launched his first business, a small tech startup that he ran out of his dorm room. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the start of something bigger. Daniel worked tirelessly, pouring every waking hour into growing his company. His efforts paid off when a venture capitalist took notice, investing heavily in his vision. That investment turned Daniel's small operation a rapidly expanding empire. Over the next decade, Daniel built a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in the industry. His business acumen was unparalleled, and his ability to predict market trends made him a force to be reckoned with. By the time he was 35, Daniel had become a millionaire many times over. His company was a household name, his face graced the covers of business magazines, and his net worth climbed higher with each passing year. But for all his success, Daniel's personal life remained empty. He had no close friends, no family to speak of, and no meaningful relationships. His life revolved around work, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Relationships, he believed, were messy and unpredictable. They introduced variables he couldn't control, and Daniel hated anything that threatened his meticulously ordered world. However, as Daniel approached his 40s, a nagging thought began to creep into his mind. What would happen to everything he'd built after he was gone? For years, he had dismissed the idea of a family. He told himself he didn't need one, that his company was his legacy. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. A company could be sold, dismantled, or forgotten. A child, on the other hand, was eternal. A child could carry his name, his values, and his vision forward, ensuring that his legacy would endure long after he was gone. The problem was that Daniel's view of relationships hadn't changed. He didn't want the complications of a wife or a partner. He wanted a child, his child, but without the emotional entanglements that came with traditional family structures. To Daniel, it seemed perfectly logical. He would find someone to carry his child, someone who wouldn't demand a relationship or emotional connection. It would be a business transaction, like any other deal he'd made in his career. Daniel's search for the right person wasn't easy. He spent months vetting candidates, each one more disappointing than the last. Some were too demanding, others had ulterior motives, and many simply didn't meet his high standards. Frustrated, Daniel began to wonder if his plan was even possible. But then one day, while walking through the city on his way to a meeting, he saw her. She was sitting on the steps of a building, her face hidden beneath the hood of an old, tattered jacket. Her posture was slumped, and her hands were clasped tightly around a small, battered thermos. Most people walked past her without a second glance, but something about her caught Daniel's attention. She wasn't begging or holding up a sign. She was just there, silent and still, as though she'd given up on the idea of being noticed. Daniel didn't stop immediately. He walked past her, heading to his meeting, but her image stayed in his mind. He couldn't explain why, but he felt drawn to her. There was something in her eyes, something resilient, despite her circumstances, that intrigued him. Later that evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city, he made a decision. He would find her and make her an offer. The next day, Daniel returned to the spot where he had seen her. She was still there, sitting on the same steps, clutching the same thermos. This time, he approached her. At first, she didn't look up, assuming he was just another passerby. But when Daniel spoke, her head lifted, and their eyes met. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. Her initial reaction was one of suspicion. People didn't talk to her unless they wanted something, and she had learned to be wary of strangers. But Daniel's tone was different, calm, measured, almost clinical. He wasn't offering charity, nor did he seem to pity her. Instead, he spoke to her as though she were an equal, someone capable of making a rational decision. As Daniel explained his plan, Emily's skepticism grew. It sounded too good to be true: financial stability, a safe place to stay, and a chance to escape the streets. But the more he talked, the more she realized he wasn't joking. He was serious, and his offer was real. For Daniel, this was a calculated risk. He didn't know much about her, but something told him she was the right person for the job. She wasn't looking for a handout, and she didn't seem to have any hidden agendas. To him, she was a blank slate, someone who could help him achieve his goal without complicating his life. As Emily considered his offer, Daniel felt a rare flicker of uncertainty. He wasn't used to relying on anyone else, especially not someone so different from himself. But he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the practicality of the arrangement. This wasn't about emotions, it was about logic, control, and securing his legacy. In that moment, neither of them could have predicted the journey they were about to embark on. For Daniel, it was a step toward ensuring his name would live on. For Emily, it was a chance to rewrite her story. And for both of them, it was the beginning of something far more complex and far more life-changing than either could have imagined. Emily's life wasn't always defined by desperation. In fact, there was a time when she believed she had a future filled with promise. She grew up in a modest home in a small town, where dreams felt attainable even if money was tight. Her mother, a schoolteacher, had instilled in her a love for books and stories, while her father, a mechanic, taught her the value of hard work. Emily was bright, curious, and full of ideas. She dreamed of becoming a writer, crafting novels that would touch people's hearts. But life has a way of derailing even the most determined dreams. It started in her late teens when her father fell ill. Medical bills quickly drained the family's savings, and her mother's meager income couldn't cover the mounting expenses. Emily tried to help, working part-time jobs after school, but it wasn't enough. When her father passed away, the family was left in financial ruin, and the emotional toll was equally devastating. Her mother, once a pillar of strength, became withdrawn and distant, unable to cope with the loss. Determined to escape her circumstances, Emily threw herself into her studies, earning a scholarship to a university in the city. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life and make her dreams a reality. But the transition wasn't easy. The scholarship covered tuition, but living expenses were another story. She worked long hours at a cafe to pay rent and buy groceries, leaving little time for classes or writing. Still, she persevered, holding on to the belief that hard work would eventually pay off. Then came the layoffs. The cafe where she worked closed its doors suddenly, leaving her without an income. She tried to find another job, but competition was fierce, and employers were hesitant to hire a young woman with limited experience. Her landlord, unsympathetic to her plight, evicted her when she couldn't make rent. With no family nearby and no friends to turn to, Emily found herself on the streets. Homelessness was a harsh reality she never thought she'd face. At first, she wandered the city, hoping to find a shelter or a temporary place to stay. But shelters were overcrowded, and the streets were unforgiving. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's optimism began to fade. She learned quickly that survival required more than just endurance. It required a hardened will. She became invisible, blending into the background of the bustling city as people rushed past her without a second glance. Her once vivid dreams of becoming a writer were now buried beneath the weight of daily survival. She no longer thought about stories or characters. Instead, her mind was consumed by more immediate concerns: where to find food, how to stay warm at night, and how to avoid the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Each day felt like a battle, and each night was a reminder of how far she had fallen. Despite the hardships, Emily refused to completely surrender to despair. She developed a routine, scavenging for food during the day and seeking refuge in quieter parts of the city at night. She avoided confrontations, trusting no one and keeping her guard up at all times. But the loneliness was overwhelming. There were moments when she'd see families laughing together or couples holding hands, and a pang of longing would hit her like a wave. She missed her mother, her old life, and the person she used to be. One cold morning, as she sat on the steps of an old building clutching her battered thermos, a man approached her. At first, she didn't look up, assuming he was just another passerby. But his voice was calm, deliberate, and unlike the dismissive tones she was used to hearing. "I'd like to talk to you," he said, his words cutting through the noise of the city around them. Emily glanced up, her eyes meeting his. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to her worn-out jacket and scuffed boots. She didn't trust him. Why would someone like him want to talk to someone like her? But there was something about his tone, his unwavering gaze, that made her pause. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cautious, edged with suspicion. The man introduced himself as Daniel and told her he had a proposition. Emily's first instinct was to walk away, assuming it was some kind of scam or worse. But Daniel was persistent, his demeanor calm and professional. He explained his plan in straightforward terms, his words devoid of emotion. He wanted her to carry his child. In exchange, he would provide her with financial stability, medical care, and a chance to rebuild her life. Emily's initial reaction was disbelief. The offer seemed surreal, like something out of a strange dream. She wondered if he was joking or testing her in some cruel way. But as he continued to speak, outlining the details of the arrangement, she realized he was serious. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, the idea of carrying a stranger's child felt deeply personal and invasive. On the other hand, this could be her way out, the chance she had been waiting for to escape the streets and start over. She asked him why he had chosen her, out of all the people he could have approached. Daniel's answer was blunt. "You seem like someone who doesn't give up easily." The words struck a chord with her. She had spent months fighting to survive, clinging to the hope that her situation would eventually change. Maybe this was the change she had been waiting for. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat on the steps of the building, replaying Daniel's words in her mind. The offer was tempting, but it came with risks. What if he didn't keep his end of the deal? What if the arrangement turned out to be more complicated than he had let on? And yet, the alternative, continuing to live on the streets, with no prospects and no future, felt even more daunting. By morning, she had made her decision. When Daniel returned, she told him she would agree to his terms, but only if he provided her with a written contract outlining every detail of the arrangement. He nodded, impressed by her pragmatism. "You're smarter than most people I've met," he said, handing her a card with his contact information. "We'll make this work." For the first time in months, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. The arrangement wasn't ideal, and it certainly wasn't how she had envisioned rebuilding her life. But it was a chance, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. As she prepared to step into a world that was completely foreign to her, she couldn't shake the feeling that her story was about to take a turn she could never have imagined. Little did she know, the journey ahead would challenge her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rediscovering who she was, and finding out what she was truly capable of. The agreement was unconventional, to say the least. Daniel presented it as though it were the simplest business transaction, stripped of any emotion or sentimentality. For him, it was a means to an end, a logical solution to a problem he couldn't solve alone. For Emily, it was far more complicated. It wasn't just about the money or the promise of stability, it was about stepping into a world she had been shut out of for so long. And most importantly, it was about trusting someone she barely knew. When Daniel handed her the contract, Emily hesitated. The pages were dense with legal jargon, outlining every aspect of their arrangement in excruciating detail. He had covered everything: her medical care, living arrangements, financial compensation, even stipulations about her diet and exercise during the pregnancy. To him, these were just practicalities, but to Emily, they were a stark reminder of how little control she would have over her own body for the next 9 months. "I need time to think about this," she said, her voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. Daniel didn't press her. "Take all the time you need," he replied. But understand that this offer won't last forever. Emily spent the next few days poring over the contract, trying to make sense of the legal terms while grappling with the enormity of what she was agreeing to. She thought about her current situation, the cold nights on the streets, the endless hunger, the constant fear of what tomorrow would bring. And then she thought about what this arrangement could offer: a roof over her head, 3 meals a day, and enough money to start over once it was all over. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the only one she had. When she finally met Daniel to give him her answer, she made one thing clear: if I'm doing this, I want some guarantees. Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What kind of guarantees? Emily looked him in the eye, her resolve stronger than ever. I want everything in writing, every promise, every term. And I want an out. If at any point I feel unsafe, or if you break your end of the deal, I'm done. Daniel nodded, respecting her assertiveness. Fair enough. I'll make the revisions. With the updated contract in hand, Emily signed her name at the bottom, sealing the deal. The weight of the decision hit her immediately. There was no turning back now. She was stepping into a life that was completely foreign to her, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead was both thrilling and terrifying. The arrangement wasn't just about money. Daniel had outlined a clear plan for her pregnancy. She would live in a furnished apartment in a secure building, far from the chaos of the streets she had known. A private doctor would oversee her care, ensuring that both she and the baby remained healthy. Her days would be structured, with scheduled checkups, nutritional plans, and even exercise routines. Everything was meticulously planned, just as Daniel liked it. But as Emily settled into her new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a tightrope. The apartment was beautiful but sterile, devoid of any warmth or personal touches. The medical appointments were efficient but impersonal, more like check-ins for a project than care for a human being. And Daniel, though always polite and professional, remained distant, treating her more like an employee than the mother of his future child. Despite the initial awkwardness, Emily began to adjust. She took solace in the small comforts of her new life: the hot showers, the soft bed, the meals she didn't have to fight for. But there were moments when the enormity of the situation would hit her, leaving her overwhelmed. She found herself talking to the baby growing inside her, finding a strange comfort in the idea that she wasn't entirely alone. For Daniel, the arrangement was progressing exactly as he had planned. He checked in regularly, always with an air of formality, asking about her health and the baby's development. But as the weeks went on, he began to notice something he hadn't anticipated: Emily's resilience. She wasn't just surviving, she was adapting, finding her footing in a situation that would have crushed most people. It was a quality he couldn't help but admire, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. Their interactions remained professional, but there were moments when the walls between them seemed to crack. One evening, during a routine visit to check on her, Daniel noticed a notebook on the coffee table. Curious, he picked it up and flipped through the pages, finding sketches and short stories scribbled in Emily's neat handwriting. "You draw?" he asked, holding up the notebook. Emily, caught off guard, nodded. "It's just something I do to pass the time." Daniel studied the sketches for a moment before setting the notebook down. "You're talented," he said, his tone genuine. It was the first time he had complimented her, and Emily wasn't sure how to respond. "Thanks," she muttered, unsure if he meant it or if he was just being polite. That small moment of connection was fleeting, but it planted a seed of understanding between them. They were two very different people brought together by an arrangement that neither fully understood. And while their relationship remained distant, the boundaries between employer and employee began to blur, setting the stage for the challenges and revelations that lay ahead. The agreement, though meticulously planned, was only the beginning. Neither Daniel nor Emily could foresee how this arrangement would change them, forcing them to confront their own fears, insecurities, and desires. For now, they remained two individuals navigating a fragile partnership, unaware of the twists and turns that would test the very foundations of their agreement. The pregnancy journey began with a strange mix of tension and routine. For Emily, every step felt like stepping into an unknown world, a sharp contrast to the harsh realities she had left behind. For Daniel, it was a process he wanted to manage and monitor meticulously, as if the pregnancy were another business project to oversee. What neither of them anticipated was how the experience would force them to confront their own vulnerabilities and grow in unexpected ways. Emily moved into the apartment Daniel had arranged, a luxurious two-bedroom space in the heart of the city. The amenities were nothing short of extravagant, gleaming hardwood floors, large windows that let in streams of sunlight, and a kitchen outfitted with the latest appliances. But despite its beauty, the place felt cold to Emily. It lacked personality, as though it was meant to house someone temporarily, someone whose presence didn't really matter. It reminded her of how she felt, a means to an end, carrying a child for a man who seemed to care more about the outcome than the process. The first few weeks were the hardest. Emily's body began to change, and with it came the emotional turbulence of pregnancy. The nausea, fatigue, and cravings were all new to her, and she felt utterly alone in navigating them. Daniel was always available, but only for practical matters, doctor appointments, nutrition plans, or adjusting her schedule. He would ask, "Are you eating enough? Taking your supplements? Getting enough rest?" But his concern never seemed to extend beyond the physical. It was like he was monitoring a checklist, not caring for a person. Her visits to the doctor became the anchors of her routine. Daniel had hired one of the best obstetricians in the city, ensuring Emily received top-tier care. The appointments were efficient but clinical, leaving little room for emotional support. Emily began to feel like a vessel, a carrier of something precious to someone else, but not valuable in her own right. Yet she resolved to push through. She reminded herself that this was temporary, a stepping stone toward the stability she desperately needed. As the pregnancy progressed, Daniel began to take a more active role, not out of personal connection, but because he wanted to ensure everything was perfect. He accompanied Emily to several appointments, meticulously questioning the doctor about every detail. Is the baby growing at the right rate? Are there any signs of complications? What's the prognosis for delivery? His questions were sharp, precise, and to the point, much like the way he handled his business meetings. But while Daniel's involvement was driven by his need for control, it didn't go unnoticed by Emily. She couldn't deny that his presence, however clinical, provided a strange sense of reassurance. He wasn't emotionally invested in her, but he was undeniably invested in the baby, and that was enough to give her a glimmer of stability in a process that often felt overwhelming. As the months went by, subtle shifts began to occur in their dynamic. It started with small gestures. One evening, Emily mentioned in passing that she missed a certain type of herbal tea she used to drink when she was younger. She didn't expect Daniel to pay attention, but the next day, a package of the tea appeared in the kitchen. Another time, she expressed frustration over the dull, sterile decor of the apartment. A week later, Daniel had a decorator bring in softer lighting, plants, and a few cozy touches. These weren't grand acts of kindness, but they were enough to make Emily feel a little less invisible. For Daniel, these small gestures weren't deliberate attempts at connection. They were simply practical responses to the situation. Yet, deep down, he began to notice a change in himself. Watching Emily navigate the challenges of pregnancy with quiet determination stirred something in him. He had always admired resilience, and Emily embodied it in a way that was raw and unpolished. It was a quality he respected but didn't fully understand. Emily, meanwhile, found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. One afternoon, during a routine check-in, Daniel asked her how she was feeling. For the first time, instead of giving a curt response, she told him the truth, that she felt lost, overwhelmed, and unsure of who she was anymore. Daniel didn't know how to respond at first. Emotional vulnerability was foreign territory for him. But instead of dismissing her feelings, he simply said, "I can't imagine what you're going through, but you're handling it better than most people would." That moment marked a turning point. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was enough to start breaking down the walls between them. They began to talk more about the baby, about their pasts, about the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Emily told him about her love for writing and the dreams she had left behind. Daniel shared bits and pieces of his own story, though he carefully avoided anything too personal. Their conversations were guarded but genuine, offering glimpses of the people they were beneath the surface. The baby's first kick was a milestone that took them both by surprise. Emily had felt it earlier in the day, a flutter of movement that made her heart skip. When Daniel stopped by that evening for one of his check-ins, she hesitated before saying, "Do you want to feel?" He looked at her, startled, but then nodded. She guided his hand to her belly, and for a moment, they both froze as the baby kicked again. It was a fleeting moment, but one that lingered in both their minds. As the due date approached, the tension began to build. Daniel's need for control intensified, and he became almost obsessive about the birth plan. He insisted on meeting with the medical team, reviewing every detail to ensure there were no surprises. Emily, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of anxiety, not just about the birth, but about what would happen afterward. She had grown attached to the life growing inside her, and the thought of parting with the baby filled her with a mix of dread and sadness. Despite their differences, they found themselves leaning on each other in unexpected ways. Daniel, who had always prided himself on his independence, began to realize that he relied on Emily more than he cared to admit. Her strength and resilience grounded him, reminding him that not everything in life could be controlled. Emily, in turn, found a strange comfort in Daniel's presence. He wasn't warm or sentimental, but he was steady, and that steadiness gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. By the time Emily went into labor, their relationship had evolved into something neither of them fully understood. They weren't friends, and they certainly weren't partners, but they had formed a bond, one built on mutual respect and the shared experience of preparing for a life they had both invested in deeply. As they stood on the precipice of the next chapter, neither Daniel nor Emily could have predicted what lay ahead. The pregnancy journey had been a test of their limits, their values, and their capacity to adapt. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear: they were no longer the same people who had signed that agreement months ago. They had changed, and so had their understanding of what this child truly meant to them. The day Emily went into labor was one neither she nor Daniel would ever forget. It began early in the morning when Emily woke up to a sharp, rhythmic pain in her abdomen. For a moment, she wasn't sure if it was real. But as the pain intensified and became more frequent, she knew the time had come. Her heart raced as a flood of emotions swept over her: excitement, fear, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty about what lay ahead. Daniel, ever the planner, was already on high alert. His phone buzzed with a call from the caretaker stationed at Emily's apartment, who informed him that Emily was in labor. He responded with characteristic efficiency, instructing the private ambulance team to arrive within minutes and notifying the hospital staff to prepare for her arrival. Yet beneath his composed demeanor, Daniel felt a flicker of something foreign: nervous anticipation. By the time Emily arrived at the hospital, the contractions were coming fast and hard. The medical team, prepped well in advance by Daniel, moved like a well-oiled machine, escorting her into a private delivery room outfitted with state-of-the-art equipment. Emily, despite the pain, couldn't help but feel like an outsider in this hyper-organized environment. Everything was cold, clinical, and calculated, just like Daniel. As the labor progressed, Emily found herself overwhelmed, not just by the physical pain but by the emotional weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a baby, this was the culmination of months of uncertainty, struggle, and growth. She thought about the countless nights she had spent talking to the child growing inside her, the small moments of connection she had felt with Daniel, and the impossible journey that had brought her to this point. And yet, there was a sense of unease she couldn't shake, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Daniel, stationed just outside the delivery room, paced back and forth. He wasn't the type to admit nerves, but his restless movements betrayed him. This was supposed to be the moment when his carefully laid plans came to fruition, the birth of the child who would carry on his legacy. And yet, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. He didn't know why, but he felt as though something was about to happen, something that would upend everything he thought he knew. The delivery itself was intense but uneventful. Emily's strength and resilience shone through as she endured the hours of labor with gritted teeth and sheer determination. The medical team worked tirelessly, offering her encouragement and guidance. When the final push came, the room filled with the sound of the baby's first cries, a piercing, beautiful noise that brought tears to Emily's eyes. For a brief moment, everything else faded away. Emily, exhausted and emotional, gazed at the tiny life she had brought into the world. The baby, a boy, was placed on her chest, and she felt an overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness. This was her child, her connection to a world that had once seemed so cruel and unforgiving. Daniel entered the room moments later, his eyes immediately locking onto the baby. He had envisioned this moment countless times, imagining what it would feel like to see his child for the first time. But as he approached Emily's bedside and got his first good look at the baby, he froze. Something was wrong. The baby was undeniably beautiful, with a healthy complexion and strong cries. But as Daniel studied the child more closely, he noticed subtle features that didn't align with his expectations. The baby's eyes, slightly upturned, held an unusual almond shape. His tiny fingers, though perfectly formed, had a characteristic curve that Daniel had seen before on medical charts. The doctor's expression shifted as well, his professionalism masking a flicker of concern. He gently took the baby from Emily's arms and carried him to a nearby station for examination. Emily, still groggy and emotional, watched with growing anxiety as the room's atmosphere changed. The once routine movements of the medical staff now felt charged with tension. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, the doctor turned to Daniel and Emily, his expression carefully neutral. "There's something I need to discuss with you," he said, his tone measured but serious. Daniel's heart sank. He felt the weight of the doctor's words before they were even spoken. Emily, clutching the hospital bed rails, braced herself for what was coming. "The baby appears to have characteristics consistent with Down syndrome," the doctor continued. "We'll need to run further tests to confirm, but based on the physical markers, it's highly likely." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. For a moment, neither Daniel nor Emily spoke. The only sound was the faint murmur of the baby, swaddled and resting peacefully in the nurse's arms. Emily was the first to break the silence. "What does that mean for him?" she asked, her voice trembling. The doctor's response was gentle but direct. He explained the basics of Down syndrome, how it occurs due to an extra chromosome, how it can affect development and physical health, and how every child with the condition is unique, with their own strengths and challenges. Emily listened intently, her mind racing. She thought about the baby's tiny fingers, his soft cries, and the way he had looked at her when he was placed on her chest. To her, none of this changed the fact that he was her son, a child she had carried for 9 months, who had become a part of her soul. Daniel, on the other hand, felt his world begin to crumble. This wasn't part of the plan. He had envisioned a child who would grow up to be just like him, strong, intelligent, and capable of carrying on his legacy. He hadn't prepared for this, hadn't even considered the possibility. His mind raced with questions. What would this mean for the future? For the child? For him? For the first time in his life, Daniel felt powerless. He had always prided himself on being able to control every aspect of his life, to plan for every contingency. But this was something he couldn't control, couldn't fix. It terrified him. As the reality began to sink in, Daniel turned to Emily. Her face was a mixture of exhaustion and quiet determination. She wasn't panicking or breaking down. She was holding herself together, focusing on the baby with a strength that left him speechless. In that moment, he realized something profound. Emily's love for the child was unconditional. It wasn't tied to expectations or plans, it simply was. The hours that followed were a blur of emotions, discussions, and decisions. The medical team reassured them that the baby was healthy and that with the right care and support, he could lead a happy and fulfilling life. But for Daniel, the path forward felt uncertain, even daunting. Emily, however, had already made up her mind. As she held the baby in her arms, she whispered softly to him, "You're perfect just the way you are." Her words were simple but powerful, carrying a weight of love and acceptance that left no room for doubt. For Daniel, the journey ahead would be one of learning and transformation. The child he had once seen as a legacy now represented something far greater, a chance to grow, to embrace imperfection, and to discover a kind of love he had never known. It wouldn't be easy, but as he looked at the baby resting peacefully in Emily's arms, he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same. The revelation of the baby's condition hit Daniel like a tidal wave, leaving him reeling in a way he had never experienced before. His carefully constructed world, where everything operated according to logic and precision, suddenly felt fragile and chaotic. As he sat in the sterile hospital lounge, staring at the clinical white walls, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. This was his son, his blood, yet he was so far from what Daniel had envisioned. For the first time in his life, Daniel didn't have a plan, and the uncertainty terrified him. Emily, on the other hand, had taken the news with quiet resilience. She was still processing the doctor's words, still trying to understand what this diagnosis would mean for her child's future. But as she held her newborn son, watching him sleep peacefully in her arms, she felt an overwhelming sense of love and protection. This wasn't about what he could or couldn't do, it was about who he was. To her, he was perfect. The first conversation between Daniel and Emily after the revelation was tense, charged with unspoken emotions. Daniel's voice was calm but strained as he spoke. "We need to think about what this means, what kind of resources he'll need, the medical care, the therapies. This is going to be complicated." Emily looked at him, her gaze steady. "He's a baby, Daniel. Right now, all he needs is love and care. We can figure the rest out as we go." Daniel bristled at her response. "You don't understand. This isn't just about love. This is about his future, about preparing him for a world that won't be kind to him." Emily's voice softened, but her words were firm. "Maybe you're right. Maybe the world won't be kind. But that's why he needs us, to show him that he's enough, just as he is." For Daniel, Emily's unwavering acceptance was both admirable and infuriating. He couldn't wrap his head around her willingness to embrace the situation without trying to change or fix it. To him, every problem had a solution, and every challenge could be overcome with enough effort. But this wasn't something he could fix. It was a reality he had to accept, and that realization left him feeling powerless in a way he had never felt before. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for both of them. Daniel threw himself into research, reading every book and article he could find about child with Down syndrome. He reached out to specialists, therapists, and support groups, compiling a list of resources and strategies. It was his way of regaining control, of finding a path forward in a situation that felt overwhelmingly uncertain. Emily, meanwhile, focused on bonding with her son. She spent hours holding him, singing to him, and studying his tiny features, marveling at the miracle of his existence. Her love for him was immediate and unconditional, and she found solace in the small moments of connection they shared. But the differences in their approaches created tension. Daniel's need for control clashed with Emily's more intuitive, emotional approach to parenting. He would suggest detailed plans and schedules, only for Emily to push back, insisting that they take things one day at a time. Their arguments were frequent but restrained, each of them trying to navigate the complexities of their new reality without alienating the other. One evening, as they sat in the apartment, the baby asleep in a bassinet nearby, their tensions came to a head. Daniel had spent the day compiling a spreadsheet of therapies and specialists, outlining a rigorous plan for the baby's development. He showed it to Emily, expecting her to be impressed by his thoroughness. Instead, she sighed and shook her head. "Daniel, he's just a newborn. He doesn't need a plan right now. He needs us to be present with him." Daniel's frustration boiled over. "I'm trying to give him the best chance at a good life, Emily. Why can't you see that?" "And I'm trying to give him a life where he feels loved and accepted," Emily shot back. "Do you even realize how much pressure you're putting on him and on yourself?" Her words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He didn't respond immediately, his mind racing as he processed what she had said. Deep down, he knew she was right. His obsession with control, with perfection, was less about the baby and more about his own fears. He was terrified of failure, terrified of not being enough for his son. But admitting that felt impossible. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to confront those fears, slowly and reluctantly. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual process of letting go. He started to spend more time with the baby, not as a project to manage but as a person to connect with. He learned to appreciate the small moments, the way his son's tiny hand would curl around his finger, the way he would smile in his sleep. These moments didn't fit into a plan or a spreadsheet, but they mattered in ways Daniel couldn't quantify. Emily, too, began to see a different side of Daniel. As he let go of his need for control, she saw glimpses of vulnerability and tenderness that she hadn't seen before. He was still the same driven, meticulous man, but he was also learning to be present in the messiness of life, a lesson Emily herself had learned long ago. Their relationship, though far from perfect, began to evolve. They found a rhythm, balancing Daniel's practicality with Emily's emotional intuition. Together, they faced the challenges of raising a child with special needs, leaning on each other in ways they hadn't expected. The arguments didn't disappear, but they became less about clashing perspectives and more about finding solutions together. Through it all, the baby became their anchor, the force that kept them grounded in the midst of their struggles. He was a reminder of what truly mattered, not perfection or control, but love, resilience, and the ability to adapt. In time, Daniel and Emily began to see their son not as a challenge to overcome but as a gift that had changed their lives in ways they never could have imagined. He had brought out the best in both of them, forcing them to grow, to confront their fears, and to embrace the uncertainty of life. The emotional fallout of the birth wasn't just about the baby's condition. It was about the journey of two people learning to navigate a new reality together. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with challenges, they knew they had the strength to face it, because they had each other, and because they had him. The turning point didn't arrive in a dramatic moment. There was no grand revelation or sudden epiphany. Instead, it crept into Daniel and Emily's lives slowly, through small, seemingly insignificant events that, together, shifted their perspectives in ways they couldn't ignore. It began with Daniel's realization that his son wasn't just an extension of himself or a legacy to shape. One afternoon, while Emily was taking a much-needed nap, Daniel was alone with the baby for the first time. He had always been cautious around his son, unsure of how to interact with him. But as he watched the baby coo and wiggle in his crib, something shifted. His son's laughter, pure and uninhibited, pulled at something deep inside him. Tentatively, Daniel leaned down and began to mimic the sounds the baby was making. To his surprise, the baby responded with a delighted giggle. For the first time, Daniel wasn't thinking about milestones or therapy plans. He wasn't analyzing or calculating. He was simply there, present in the moment, connecting with his son. It was a small moment, but it planted a seed, a realization that his son wasn't a project or a problem to solve. He was a person, a tiny human who just wanted to be loved. For Emily, the turning point came during one of her many quiet moments with her son. She had always been deeply connected to him, but as the weeks went by, she found herself worrying less about the challenges he might face and focusing more on the joy he brought into her life. One evening, as she rocked him to sleep, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had spent so much of her life struggling to survive, but now, holding her son in her arms, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He had given her life new meaning, and she was determined to give him the best life she could, no matter what. These individual moments of clarity began to ripple outward, affecting how Daniel and Emily interacted with each other. Their initial relationship had been transactional, built on necessity rather than trust or understanding. But as they began to see their son not as a challenge but as a gift, they started to find common ground. One day, Daniel approached Emily with an uncharacteristic air of humility. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone softer than she was used to. "I don't want to just plan for his future. I want to be part of it." Emily looked at him, surprised but hopeful. "What does that mean for you?" "It means letting go of the idea that I can control everything," Daniel admitted. "It means learning to be present, even when things don't go the way I expect. I want to do better, not just for him, but for both of you." Emily nodded, her eyes welling with tears. She had seen glimpses of this side of Daniel before, but hearing him express it so openly felt like a breakthrough. "I think we're all learning as we go," she said gently. "None of us have all the answers. But we'll figure it out, together." From that moment on, their dynamic began to change. They started to function more as a team, sharing responsibilities and supporting each other in ways that went beyond the terms of their original agreement. Daniel, once hyper-focused on perfection, began to embrace the messy, unpredictable nature of parenting. He learned to celebrate small victories, his son's first smile, the way he responded to a favorite toy, and stopped fixating on what the future might hold. Emily, who had always been fiercely independent, found herself leaning on Daniel more than she expected. His determination and resourcefulness complemented her warmth and intuition, creating a balance that neither of them had anticipated. Together, they began to build a life that wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The turning point wasn't just about their son, it was about what he represented. He was a reminder that life wasn't meant to be controlled or planned to perfection. It was meant to be lived, with all its imperfections and uncertainties. Through him, Daniel and Emily learned to let go of their fears and embrace the beauty of the present. By the time their son's first birthday rolled around, they had come a long way. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but they faced it with a newfound sense of hope and determination. The turning point had shown them that love, resilience, and connection were stronger than any obstacle. And in the end, that was all they needed. The year that followed their son's birth was nothing short of transformative. For both Daniel and Emily, it was a journey of learning, growth, and redefining what truly mattered in life. The initial shock and uncertainty of their situation gradually gave way to a sense of purpose, driven by their shared commitment to their son and, unexpectedly, to each other. Daniel, once a man consumed by the pursuit of perfection and legacy, had become a different person. The meticulous spreadsheets and rigid plans that had once governed his approach to parenting now gathered dust in the corner of his office. Instead, Daniel found himself focusing on the simple joys of fatherhood. Whether it was playing peekaboo, watching his son learn to crawl, or soothing him to sleep after a long day, Daniel began to find meaning in the moments he once would have dismissed as unproductive. Emily, too, had undergone a profound change. The woman who had once seen herself as a survivor, constantly bracing for the next hardship, now saw herself as something more: a mother, a nurturer, and a protector. Her son had awakened in her a strength she didn't know she had, along with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. The stability provided by their arrangement with Daniel gave her the space to dream again. She began writing in the evenings, her old notebook filled with sketches and stories that reflected the newfound optimism in her life. Together, Daniel and Emily created a home filled with love and laughter. It wasn't perfect. They still had their disagreements, and the challenges of raising a child with Down syndrome often tested their patience and resolve. But they faced those challenges head-on, united by their shared love for their son. They learned to lean on each other, their once fractured relationship evolving into a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. One of the most pivotal moments came during their son's first birthday celebration. It was a small, intimate gathering, just the three of them, a cake, and a few balloons. As Daniel helped his son blow out the single candle on the cake, he felt a surge of pride and gratitude. This child, who had once represented his fear of imperfection, had become the greatest source of joy and meaning in his life. After the cake was cut, Emily handed Daniel a photo album she had been working on secretly for months. Inside were pictures documenting their son's first year, his first bath, his first smile, his first steps. As Daniel flipped through the pages, he was struck by how much they had all changed. The rigid, perfection-driven man in the early photos felt like a stranger to him now. In his place was a father who had learned to embrace the messy, beautiful chaos of life. "Thank you for this," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion as he closed the album. "I didn't realize how much I needed to see this, to see how far we've come." Emily smiled, her eyes soft. "We've come a long way, haven't we? And we still have so much further to go. But I think we're ready for whatever comes next." Their son, oblivious to the profound moment unfolding between his parents, clapped his hands with delight, smearing frosting on his face. The sight made both Daniel and Emily laugh, their shared joy dissolving any lingering tension between them. In that moment, they weren't just two people brought together by an unusual agreement, they were a family. The resolution to their story wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning. It was the start of a life built on love, resilience, and the lessons they had learned along the way. Daniel had discovered that legacy wasn't about leaving behind a name or an empire. It was about the impact you made on the people you loved. Emily had found a sense of belonging and purpose, proving to herself that she was capable of so much more than mere survival. Their son, with his curious eyes and infectious laughter, became the glue that held them together. Through him, they learned to let go of their fears, embrace imperfection, and find beauty in the everyday. Their journey was far from over, but they faced the future with open hearts, ready to tackle whatever came their way. As Daniel and Emily tucked their son into bed that night, they shared a quiet moment of reflection. Neither of them had expected their lives to take this path, but neither of them could imagine it any other way. The challenges, the fears, the unexpected twists, all of it had brought them here, to a place where love and connection reigned over doubt and uncertainty. And as they stood together, watching their son sleep, They knew one thing for certain. They were no longer defined by the circumstances that had brought them together. They were defined by the choices they had made, the love they had found, and the family they had built, one imperfect, extraordinary moment at a time. Life has a way of taking us down paths we never imagined. For Daniel and Emily, what began as a cold, calculated arrangement became a journey that transformed them in ways neither could have foreseen. Their son, the unassuming force at the center of their story, became more than just a child. He became a catalyst for growth, healing, and connection. For Daniel, the experience redefined his understanding of legacy. He had spent his life chasing perfection, believing his worth lay in his achievements and the empire he had built. But in the small, imperfect moments of fatherhood, his son's laughter, the quiet late-night feedings, the milestones that came on their own time, Daniel discovered the true meaning of legacy. It wasn't about control or success. It was about love and the lasting impact of being present for the people who mattered. Emily's transformation was equally profound. From the depths of despair and survival, she found strength and purpose in being a mother. Her son gave her a reason to hope again, to dream of a better future, and to embrace the resilience she had cultivated through years of hardship. She learned that her worth wasn't tied to her struggles but to the love and care she could give to her child. Together, Daniel and Emily built a life that defied the odds. It wasn't perfect. There were challenges, arguments, and moments of doubt, but it was real. They learned to lean on each other, blending Daniel's practicality with Emily's warmth to create a partnership that worked not because it was planned, but because it was rooted in mutual respect and love for their son. Their story is a reminder that life's greatest lessons often come from the unexpected. It shows us that love has the power to heal, that imperfection can be beautiful, and that the connections we build with others are what truly give life meaning. In the end, it wasn't the plan that defined them, it was the love they found along the way. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more real-life tales that'll make you think. And don't forget to check out the next video. It's one you don't want to miss.